Okay, thank you. Thank you, Leslie. And thank everybody for being here. My name is Mitchell and I am an alcoholic. I just, I look at the Zoom meetings as probably one of the, it's a double-edged sword. It's one of the worst times that we've had in a long time. And it's also what one of the best times as far as AA stuff goes, because, we're able to just travel anywhere we want to go and have a meeting in, I don't know how many continents we have on here right now, but all over the world, Australia, Ireland, Mexico, Florida, Connecticut, you name it, it's here pretty much. And I love that. It's so amazing just hearing, like I said, the accents or different people's different experiences. And AA is pretty much the same no matter where you go. I mean, there are some, minor differences between the geographical stuff. But just to, start off, my story is pretty much a run-of-the-mill alcoholic story. I believe that people in AA all have the same story. We just use different words. And it's not about, how much we drank, when we drank, who we drank with, how much, where it led us. It's kind of like what it did to us and brought us to where we are today. Just to steal a line from my sponsor, I was born at an early age and it was downhill from there. And that's what I like to think about my life. It was a pretty easy childhood up until around the age of, I would say around 13, 14, 12. My memory is not the world's greatest on when I started drinking, but what happened was I was in school and my parents were going away from their apartment and I wasn't a very social person. I didn't get along with too many people. I kind of was very shy. And what happened was that since my parents were going away, I asked a whole bunch of people, if we could have a party at my parents' apartment. And they had alcohol in the house and I hadn't had a drink before then or anything else. But I enticed everybody to come by saying that, there'd be, plenty of booze there. And there was, and everybody had a great old time. Drank up all my parents' alcohol. And I can remember, vaguely, my first drink was absolutely horrible. It burnt, it felt terrible, it made me nauseated. It was just one of the worst experiences that I ever had. I was wondering why do people, I was looking around the room and was wondering why everybody was doing that. And then I took a second drink and a third drink and a fourth drink. And from there, it was, just I started feeling like I belonged. I wasn't apart from, I was a part of. And I was getting along with everybody. I was laughing. I was having a great old time. And I figured, this is a really good thing, so I'm going to keep doing it. And that's what happened. My parents came home. A couple of weeks later, they had some company over at the house. Took out their, the bottles from the closet, and the bottles were all empty. And they asked me what was going on. I said, I don't know, maybe it evaporated. Maybe it was in there too long. Because nobody in my family drank up until that point. And they just replaced all the bottles. And I started, drinking, from their bottles. I quickly became a daily drinker, even though I was still in school. My parents, found out about it. They said, you can't keep doing this. You can't drink the alcohol. You're too young. It's not legal. It's not good for you. And I said, okay, I won't do that. What I started doing then was I started brewing some tea. And as I emptied a bottle, I would, fill up the bottle with the color tea that the alcohol was supposed to look like. And the next time my parents had company over, they poured out the booze to, serve their guests. And it was really disgustingly warm old tea. And there was that particular point, my parents locked up all the booze in the house. So that's what I did. And I continued drinking and what I prefer to call better living through chemistry after that. I was introduced to all kinds of stuff. And I believe also that since this is an AA meeting, I respect the house I'm in and I don't get into all the other stuff that was part of my story. things, flash forward, went on to, I got married, and, again, was drinking every day, and doing what alcoholics do. I always had booze in the house. I always had stuff going on. And we eventually moved up to upstate New York, up to Orange County, New York, which is different than Orange County, California, and Orange County, Florida, and Orange County everywhere else. There is an Orange County in New York. We moved up to Orange County, and the nice thing about the house we were going to rent, it was right across the street from a bar. And being a 60s kind of person, the name of the bar was the White Rabbit Inn. And if anybody grew up in that era, the White Rabbit is an interesting song by the Jefferson Airplane. And I realized that I didn't have to worry about getting a DWI or arrested or getting into an accident while I'm drinking. All I had to do was walk across the street, get drunk, and just manage to walk my way, across the street back home again. I realized after a while that I didn't like bar drinking. I didn't like the whole social aspect of it. The thing I didn't like the most was I could buy a bottle that I could not have to share with anybody for the same price as the bar was charging for about 3 or 4 drinks. And I decided at that particular time, I'm just going to drink at home, and that's what I did. I didn't socialize. I just got drunk. I was at that time commuting into New York City, taking the bus, had a bottle under my front seat, and I would be sloshed by the time I caught the bus in the morning, about 5 o'clock in the morning. It was getting, bad. My wife at the time was complaining a lot about my drinking. I told her I was only drinking 3-4 glasses a day. I forgot to put in the fact that those were 16-ounce Burger King glasses. And that was something that I did. So, I was drinking, 64, 80 ounces of booze every day. And it wasn't, it was usually, vodka and some other stuff, screwdrivers or White Russians or Black Russians or whatever. So that's what I was doing. I really was not in great shape. I lost a bunch of jobs. A couple times almost lost my marriage. I promised to quit drinking. I did for a few days. Then I snuck it. Then I always had a couple of bottles of mouthwash in the car. And before I came home, I just, rinsed out and came home and say, "Hi, honey, I'm home." One particular time I remember my wife and I were having an argument. And within that argument, I decided to, walk out of the room in a huff and pushed open the door. It was a glass door, and I missed the wood part of the door, and I put my hand through the glass. We called the ambulance. Actually, my wife called the ambulance, and 57 stitches later, I was laying there, all kind of like doped up from whatever they were giving me to kill the pain. And the doctor said, you're all stitched up, go home, relax, drink a couple glasses of wine. And my wife kind of gave him a really bad look and said, that's what brought him here. And so that's what I said, well, I'm not going to have any wine. So I didn't when I came home. But the next day I did get drunk again. That continued. I was a daily drunk and having problems all over the place. My wife at the time joined another fellowship called Overeaters Anonymous. And she kept bringing home pamphlets, AA pamphlets. And those AA pamphlets, she was, handing me. And I looked at them and I said, that's great for those people. They have a program. I don't have a problem. My, rationalization is that when I get as bad as the next guy, I'll stop drinking. And when I got as bad as the next guy, I found another guy who was a little bit worse. And that's what I did. I just kept doing it. She started telling me that, I have to go to AA. And I said, I'm not going to AA. I don't need AA. I'm not an alcoholic. I was still commuting into the city by bus. And what she did was took all the magazines and the books out of the bathroom. And the only thing I had left to read in the bathroom at 4 o'clock in the morning was, a bunch of AA pamphlets, which I did. And again, I didn't think it was for me. There came a point where I was visiting my parents in the Bronx, and they wouldn't let me drink in their house for obvious reasons. And so I decided to take a walk, and which I did. I took a walk through the neighborhood. And I don't know, divine providence, coincidence, luck as it may be, I was passing by a church, and that church had a little round silver sign on the front door with a circle, a blue circle and triangle on it. And I remembered that symbol from the pamphlets, and I kind of staggered into that church. Didn't know what to expect. At that particular time, I weighed close to 300 pounds. I hadn't bathed in weeks. I stunk. I was like shaking. I was in, really bad shape. And I walked in there, and I was at the age of, I think it was like 27. I was the youngest person in the room. And I just looked around, and the next thing I know, somebody's standing next to me. And they kind of led me over to a row of chairs. And one of these older guys sat down next to me. Pretty soon another one sat down on the other side. Then the next one sat down, behind me. Next thing I knew, one of the guys had his arm around my shoulder, and I was kind of looking at him kind of funny, but I was in no shape to question anything at that point. And what he was doing was stopping me from shaking. And I just, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to hear anything or get through the meeting. I don't remember what was said at that meeting. I do remember that it was a meeting in the Bronx, and that these old guys, held me through the meeting and talked to me afterwards. They explained to me that all I had to do was not drink and go to meetings. And that's what I did. I told them, I said I would do that. And when I got home the next day, I told my wife that I had decided to decided to stop drinking, and then I was going to start going to AA meetings. She smiled at me and walked away and said, we'll see how long that lasts. And it did last. It did last, the first year, all I did was not drink and go to meetings. Nobody told me about steps. Nobody told me about the book. Nobody told me about anything other than the fact that I should just go to meetings and not drink. And if that didn't work, switch that around and go to meetings, don't drink, or don't drink and go to meetings. If your rear end falls off, pick it up, take it to a meeting. All the usual slogans newcomers hear. And that's what I did. I was still not a nice person. I was still getting angry, losing my temper, lying, cheating, stealing, doing everything that I shouldn't do. There came a point in my recovery, my sponsor called it my sobriety, that nothing was working. After a couple of years sober, it was about 3 years sober, I had lost over 100 pounds. I looked good as far as I'm concerned. Women were looking at me differently than they ever have, because I was always this little fat kid. And I made a decision, to try out my new body and my new life and my new sobriety, and I went and had an affair. That lasted a little while, and I came home from work one day, and my wife handed me the phone, and she said, somebody wants to talk to you. And I picked up the phone, and it was my girlfriend. I didn't think that my wife would look at the phone bill and say, what is this number that my husband is calling at 2 a.m. or at midnight, or, at odd hours. So I was caught. I was found out. I was told that, because we had a infant child, that it would be better for me to stay in the house, but sleep downstairs on the couch. And that's what I did for a while. My life was really falling apart. I just didn't know what to do. I went to my home group, and my home group was starting, and a guy walked into the group, and he said, I had a lousy day at work. I slammed the door, kicked the dog, yelled at the kids, almost hit the wife, but I didn't take a drink, and I'm a winner. And everybody applauded, and I just sat there crying. And that's when I knew something was definitely wrong. If this is what recovery means, I don't want it anymore. I knew that I just felt like I felt like dying. I didn't feel like drinking so much as I felt like dying, but I didn't want to die because I had a new kid, and it was just, really a bad time in my life. So I went on a spiritual search. I talked to priests and rabbis and every other religious person, read tons of books. I was told by a priest that I should read Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, which I did. I read all kinds of other religious books. Nothing was helping me. I was just totally miserable. At that particular point that I started reading the big book, again, nobody had told me to read the book. They just said, don't drink and go to meetings, because that's what you do in New York, pretty much. And what happened after that is that I was reading the book, and I was reading, the beginning of the book, and I was reading the stories in the book. And what I was seeing in the book, and what I was reading in the book, were different things than I was hearing in the rooms of AA. I was hearing a lot more than just don't drink and go to meetings. And the only thing I have to do is not drink, and everything gets better. The old saying, it gets better. Even today, I don't believe that it gets better. I know I get better. And so it remains pretty much like a roller coaster. And I always say that this has been the greatest roller coaster I've ever been on. So it doesn't get better, at least in my opinion. I do. And I started looking for people. I started going all over the place. I started hearing about meetings that were supposed to be good meetings in Long Island. So I drove like 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours to meetings in Long Island. Still was the same thing. I drove further upstate New York. I went to meetings in Connecticut. I went to meetings in Massachusetts. I went to meetings all over the place. I was still hearing the same stuff. And that's not what I wanted. So I found out about AA had a loaners program. And the loaners program is meetings by mail. Meetings by mail was for people who were shut-ins, merchant marines, folks who were in nursing homes, hospitals, whatever, for long terms. And they would write to each other, and it would be kind of like a pen pal. And that's what I did. I started writing this old timer who came in 1947. And we were talking about the old days, because that's what I wanted. I didn't want what I was hearing in the meetings. What I wanted was what the old timers had. And we wrote and wrote and wrote for several months. And he said that if I really wanted to know what it was like, from the horse's mouth, he gave me the name of somebody who came in 1938, was sponsored by Dr. Bob. I thought all those old guys were dead at this particular point, but there was one left. And asked and told me that, to contact this person. And I did. I wrote him a letter. And after I mailed the letter, the next day I sat there and I said, you know what? I'm a nobody. I'm just this, 4 or 5 year sober person. And, what if this guy doesn't write back to me? And I got scared because, again, my life was flashing before my eyes. I knew that everything was falling apart. And I said, I can't wait for him to write back to me. So I called information. The days long before Google and the internet. So I had to call 411 and talk to the operator and gave him his name and address and got his phone number and called. I sat there and talked to his wife for a while because he wasn't home. And within about 20 minutes or so, he came home and we started talking. The bells went off in my head. The little goosebumps all over me, started happening because from what his voice sounded like and what our conversation was going, I wanted what he had. And I wanted that peace, that serenity, the knowledge of the program, the way it was originally intended and the way it was originally written. And so I said to him, he was living in Florida, I was living in New York, and I said, I want you to be my sponsor. And what he told me was, fine, come on down to Florida. We'll spend some time together. We'll go through the steps. And I again, being an alcoholic, I figured I really don't want to spend, the figure I remember was about $150 round trip to fly back and forth to Florida. Might have been less than that. And I was trying to figure out a way of getting him to come to New York without me having to pay for it. So what we did was we talked about him coming up and doing a retreat in New York. And I planned it out. We worked on it. And I laid out the money for his airline tickets, his wife's airline tickets, made the reservation for the motel he was going to be at, send out tons of flyers. expecting that all you good people would be paying for this man to come up to New York and take me through the steps. Unfortunately, God has got a very weird sense of humor. What happened is that I ended up paying for most of, the hotel. I ended up personally paying for his airfare. I ended up personally paying for, all kinds of stuff that was connected with the retreat. Something that would have cost me about $150 ended up costing me around $1,500, which didn't make me very happy. But if that was the price I had to pay to get sober, what I consider sober, that's what I did. We started the retreat. This is Friday evening. At one of the breaks, I cornered him in the hallway, and I said, I want you to be my sponsor. I want you to take me through the steps. And he said, we'll talk about it. Half an hour later, I must have asked him that maybe a dozen times that evening. As he was returning to his room after the last session that night, I said, this is it. I can't do it anymore. I have to be taken through the steps. I have to have what you have. I have to have the same kind of recovery that I was reading about in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And he started asking me some questions, and those questions are pretty much like, are you an alcoholic? Are you sick? Yes. Do you want to get well? Definitely. When do you want to get well? I want to get well tonight. He said, what are you willing to do to get well? I said, anything that you say, I'm willing to do. And he said, maybe we can work together. He brought me into his room, and his wife was sitting at a desk, in the hotel room, and she smiled, and I sat down, and he said, tell me your story, qualify. And qualifying to him meant telling my story, giving what we do in a share, but more and more detailed than I would on an AA talk. Mainly because on an AA talk, as far as I'm concerned right now, the book gives me directions on how to tell my story. It says our story is disclosed in a general way, what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now. Those three things are experience, strength, and hope. It tells me to share more strength and hope than it does experience. But he wanted to hear everything. He wanted to hear all the stuff I had done, all the crazy things that went on, talking about how, I used to jump across rooftops to run away from the police, and not even thinking that, I might miss the other side, the insanity of what I was doing, the insanity of the things that happened in my life. So after about, let's say about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, again, the time is kind of fuzzy for me right now, but he said, congratulations, you've just done the first step. And I had been sober, I would say close to 5 years at that particular point, 5 years. And I said, that's impossible. I've been told in meetings that, you don't get your brains out of hock until like 5 years. And I certainly didn't have my brains out of hock because life was totally insane. I was also told that, you do a step a year. I was told that, sometimes it takes, 5, 10 years to go through the steps. And I said, I can't wait that long. I can't, I want my life to be more together. I want to be happy, joyous, and free, like the book talks about. He said that, what does the first step say? I said, the first step says we admitted we're powerless over alcohol. He said, don't you think that by what you just shared with me for the last couple of hours is admitting that you were powerless over alcohol? I said, yes. He said, what does the second part of the step say? That our lives have become unmanageable. He said, I think, from what I heard, your life was and still is pretty unmanageable. And I agreed with him. And he said, well, you've accomplished what the first step calls for. All it calls for, admitting I'm powerless and my life is unmanageable. He said, do you want to continue? And I said, of course. I was still totally confused. I had no idea that somebody can go through a first step in a matter of a couple hours. He said, what does the second step say? He says, came to believe that a power greater than myself, than ourselves, could restore us to sanity. He said, if you remember what you were talking about, the way your life was going, the unmanageability, the insanity, is that, wouldn't you like your life restored to sanity? And I told him, yeah, of course, that's why I'm talking to you. And, he said, do you believe in God? And I said, well, kind of. He said, what do you mean, kind of? And I explained to him that the God I believed in, my higher power, was really me, because every time I wanted to steal something from my employer, I said, God, look the other way. If I wanted to cheat on my wife, I said, God, look the other way. Anything I wanted to do that was not right for me, I just asked God to kind of like go in the other room, turn around, shut his eyes, and just do what I want. So he said, obviously, your God doesn't work for you. I said, definitely not. He said, do you think that a real higher power, not you, could restore you to sanity? And I said, of course. And he told me well, you just done step 2. I looked at him again and I shook my head and I said, it's too simple. And he said, the steps are very simple. The program is very simple. The only problem is an alcoholic can screw up a 2-car funeral. And we do all the time. We screw things up because we complicate it. We, analyze, don't utilize, or, one of the other slogans that go with that. So we went through this step. He told me, in step 3 that, made a decision to turn my life and my will over to the care of God as I understand him. And I said, I really don't understand who or what God is, or any concept of a higher power, other than the fact that I was the higher power. And he told me that since your higher power isn't working, and since, mine had been working for over 40 years at that particular time, he said, would you like to borrow mine until you develop a concept of a higher power? And I said, definitely. Now, he was a Christian for his whole life, pretty much. And he said, get on your knees. And I said, okay. And he looks at me and he says, Jesus, this is Mitchell. And I said, oh, wait a minute. Nice Jewish boy from the Bronx does not, say those words. So he stood up and he went to the door and opened the door. He said, I think you should find somebody who can give you what you want the way you want it. You came to me for help, and that's, what we're going to do. And I decided, again, I did not want to lose this. So I went through the 3rd step with him, and we worked on that. And again, every time I said, but, he went to the door, opened the door, and said, find somebody who can give you the way you want it. I later kind of simplified that by when people tell me that stuff, I say, especially in a meeting, and I'll say, what does it say in the front of the meeting? It says Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, oh, I thought it said Burger King. And people look at me funny and they say, what do you mean? You can't have it your way. You come to me or you come to AA for help, because everything is unmanageable. You're powerless. And so therefore you can't have, extra pickles or leave out the lettuce or leave out the special sauce or whatever you want to leave out. It's, you buy the whole package. I've been reading some articles by Dr. Silkworth from the 40s. And what he pretty much says is that, in order to make it in AA, you can't have reservations. You have to buy the whole package. And it says, these were the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. Doesn't say the steps are suggested or the individual steps are suggested. It says it's a program of recovery, which is suggested. The whole package is suggested. And that's what I believe in today. We went through the 4th step, and I had been through a couple of 4th steps earlier on, and those were pretty much, I wrote like autobiographies, and then again being kind of like a dope fiend kind of person. My daughter was a couple years old in the crib, and I sat down and I read my 4th step to her. I gave her my 5th step. She was sitting there making gurgling noises and saying, baby talk and all this other stuff. The step doesn't says, to God, to ourselves, and another human being. The step doesn't say the person has to speak English. The step doesn't say the person has to understand anything I'm saying. I was giving it to another human being. That didn't work with Clarence too well. We went over the fourth step to identify my character defects. And the character defects are the things that caused me to do, he had a list of about 20 things, pride and greed and lust and all, the usual 20, there's an asset and liability card floating around. I think Hazelton has a couple of copies of the different ones. And we went over those defects. And we had to identify the things that caused me to do the things I did, the bad things, the things that were unmanageable and made my life worse. And during that whole process, we managed to go through the fourth and fifth step in a matter of, again, another 2-3 hours. Here we are, like already in the middle of the night, and I'm sitting there totally confused because I have no idea that this was possible. We went through and we said we're going to resume it in the next morning. We started continuing going through the steps. We got up to the make a list step. Again, early recovery, I tried to fix that step by saying we made a list of all persons we had harmed and asked God to remove them. To me, that worked really well because if God removed everybody, I wouldn't have to make an amends to them. So again, that didn't work with Clarence, and we went through everything and how I was going to make the list, who I was going to make the list, and using my fourth step stuff that we did. We continue with the steps. We went through up to step 9 and went through the construction and steps. Some people call them maintenance steps, construction steps, continual steps, because he said that 9, 10, 11, and 12 encompass the first 9 steps. And so, which is true. I mean, when we're wrong, promptly admitted it. There's a line. I always wonder about where things come from in AA. There's a line in the book called "How to Win Friends and Influence People" by Dale Carnegie. And Dale Carnegie, was one of the people that Bill W. looked up to. And there's a line, there's a chapter in that book that said pretty much is that when you're wrong, promptly admit it and do it emphatically. So I got a funny feeling that's partially where that step kind of came from, along with some of the Oxford group stuff, and improving my conscious contact with God as I understand it, and having had a spiritual experience, which is what happened to me, between those from Friday night to Sunday afternoon, working through the steps. I had a major spiritual experience, a major awakening. And he said to me afterwards is that you now have what I have. I am your equal now. It's not like sponsor-sponsee relationship. We have the same exact thing. You want to call me, call me. You don't want to call me, don't call me. I'm not going to be, answering every question in your life because that's not the job of a sponsor. He explained to me, job of a sponsor is take somebody through the steps. Everybody else, it says in the big book about, a fellowship will grow up around you. And that fellowship for me today are people who are friends and people I trust and care about me. And so those are the people I go through for all the little mundane stuff. And so this is what happened was. And I went out and people came up at the end of the retreat and said, Clarence, I want you to take you through the steps. And this was like late Sunday afternoon, early Sunday evening. Clarence looked at me and said, you got work to do. And they said, no, I want Clarence to take me through the steps. And Clarence said, well, he's got exactly what I have. So I'm packing up to leave. We're catching a plane tomorrow morning. So talk to Mitchell. And that's the way it's been ever since. Want to get into some of what I call coincidences in AA, which give me, goosebumps or chills or whatever you want to call them. How I met Clarence was through an old timer in Ohio who gave me his name. How Clarence met Dr. Bob was another one of those interesting coincidence stories. Some people, I call them the God stories. Clarence was homeless and on the bum in New York City, kicked out of his house in Cleveland, and he was his sister-in-law had a house in Yonkers, New York, in Westchester, and he went up there and I guess wanted to bum some money off of her, and she wasn't home, but her kids were with the nanny, and he was playing out in the front lawn with the kids, rolling around. His sister-in-law came home, saw this going on. She got totally freaked out by it because this guy had been on the bum in the streets and wearing the same clothes probably for, a year. And she kicked him out and told him to go away. She immediately called her personal physician and said, I want you to look at my kids. I want you to test them. I want you to see if they can catch anything from this, my drunken brother-in-law. She went to the doctor, explained that, her brother-in-law's a drunk and he was just, a hopeless case. And her doctor said he knows of another doctor in Akron, Ohio, who the term they used back then was fixes drunks. And he gave her the name and address of Dr. Bob. And the strange thing is that the person who was her personal physician just happened to be Leonard Strong, who's Bill's brother-in-law. And Clarence, again, went eventually back to Cleveland, met Dr. Bob, went through, the Oxford Group program, and went on for a little over 46 years of sobriety, just carrying the message of AA. There's so many different coincidences and God stories. Another one, briefly is I was flying home from visiting with Clarence on the plane, and the little voice in my head, and I listen to these voices today because they don't steer me wrong, because I kind of know where they're coming from, and they don't give me a bad feeling, they give me a good one. And the voice says, take your big book down from the overhead bin in the plane. I had no reason to want to read the book at that particular point. The flight was going well, but I listened to the voice, got up, took the book down, sat back down. The woman sitting next to me got hysterical crying. I said, did I step on your toe? Did I do something wrong? What did I do to make you cry? And she goes, why'd you have to take down that book? And I looked at her and said, this book? And she said, yes. She went on to explain to me that she was, about 4,000 miles from home. She was going to ask the flight attendant for a drink. She had been sober for, a year, and nobody would know. She'd be up in an airplane, I don't know how many thousands of feet up in the air, away from home. Nobody would know she'd have a drink, and she could get away with it. We ended up spending the rest of the flight talking about recovery. As far as I know, she didn't take a drink. We got off the plane, shook hands, and kind of said, go on your merry way, and I'm glad I was able to stop you from picking up a drink. And it really wasn't me that was stopping her from picking up a drink. My life has been, again, the greatest roller coaster I've ever been on. And part of that roller coaster was, again, coincidentally meeting people. I had gotten to know Nell Wing, who was Bill's secretary and AA's first archivist, and a good friend of Bill and Lois. And Nell let me into the archives and let me, like a little kid, play in the archives and read all the stuff and go through the history, because I became, obsessed and in love with the history of AA, and continuing, to do so. I've been studying AA history for more than 40 years now, so it's been a joy in my life. It's enhanced my recovery. Then about 2 years later, I moved into New York City and was living in New York City, and I walked outside, and lo and behold, there's Nell Wing standing on the corner. And I said, what are you doing here? She said, I live here. Nell happened to be living in the building next to me. She said, I'm going up to visit Lois, and I'm going to go catch a bus. And I said, don't worry about a bus, I'll drive you. My car was parked in front of the apartment building, and that's what I did. And that's how I met Lois Wilson. I met so many great people, through, again, coincidence, through providence, through whatever you want to call it, in AA, that it has been just an amazing journey of exploring and reading and seeing things and constantly learning. And that's what I do. If I don't learn every day, if I don't get better every day, I wake up every morning and there's this whole, lockdown piece. For me, it's been, sometimes a blessing, sometimes a curse. I get up in the morning and I have quiet time every morning and meditation. And during my quiet time, I say, okay, God, what do you want me to do today? And sometimes the answer is, well, the same thing you did yesterday. You stay home, you try and stay alive and take it one day at a time. And some days God says, well, you got to go out and do something today. So I do that. I haven't been to a meeting since the beginning of March, like other than online, and I do that. And it's been just, a wonderful life. It's learning, reading, researching stuff. Currently researching one of the early, probably the first Jewish member of AA who came in, I think, in 1940, who was sponsored by Clarence. And he had a hard time staying sober. And what happened is that he traveled around the country. He was a traveling salesperson. He started meetings all over the South and throughout a lot of the country. Again, for somebody who could hardly stay sober, he started probably more meetings than any person, in AA history, just due to his travels. Studying all about him, studying about his family, researching this stuff. I just love doing it. It enhances my recovery, and going online to meetings all over the world enhances my recovery. Seeing some really great people and getting in touch with great people. I've met some really, really nice people. Just to kind of like close things up, there was a line, in the story, in the big book, it's Chet R. And the story is It Might Have Been Worse. And it's in the 2nd through the 4th edition. And Chet wrote was, study the AA book, just don't read it. And I firmly believe that, because there's stuff hidden in that book that I keep seeing today that I didn't see last month, last year, or last week. Everything just keeps popping up to me depending on the mood I'm in, depending on where I am. I encourage people to study the book, learn about not only the book, but the people who are in the book, their stories. Don't just read the story in the book. What I do now is, if I read a story and I find it interesting, and I read them all several times, I'll go to Google and I'll, Google the name of the story, and then I'll just put in next to it AA speaker. And then what happens with that is that usually most of the stories people are speaking. So I get to hear, what they sound like, and hear them tell not only their story, but other stuff. So for me, the old Joe and Charlie thing was making the big book coming alive. For me, the big book came alive when I saw pictures of these people. It came alive when I heard their voices, came alive when I learned about who they were, who their families were, where they lived, where they're buried. It's kind of morbid. There's a site called Find a Grave, and I've been to most of the original members, their grave sites on, online, and seen where they're buried. And even had opportunities in my travels to go visit quite a few of those graves and pay my respects to those people. Been out to Akron, been out to all the other places, Wilson House and Stepping Stones and everywhere else. And I love the history. I love what it's done for me and how it's enhanced my life. And I see it's about a little after about a quarter out. Ended here. And thank you all for being here and enduring my talk. Thank you.